She is just a stubborn grunt hanging on to old deployment stories because she does not have a real career in the actual world. My father's voice carried over the clinking silver and fine bone china. Richard swung a heavy glass of expensive red wine, the dark liquid sloshing dangerously close to the crystal rim. He threw those words down the length of the country club ballroom like a fragmentation grenade meant just for me. Around his table, men in custom-tailored suits chuckled. It was that specific oily laugh of corporate pity. The kind of laugh produced by men who have never had dirt under their fingernails, men who measure a human life by the brand of a watch and the size of a stock portfolio. I sat at the overflow table, the one shoved right next to the kitchen swinging doors and the dark hallway leading to the restrooms. I did not look up. I pulled the cold metal zipper of my cheap clutch purse, hiding my hands under the thick white tablecloth so no one could see my knuckles turning bone white against my thighs. The air inside the Columbus, Ohio Country Club was suffocating. It smelled of fermented champagne, heavy floral centerpieces, and raw, unchecked ego. A waiter brushed past my shoulder, nearly knocking my water glass over. The silver fork on my plate scraped against the porcelain as I shifted my weight. The sound grated against my spine like a rusty nail on sheet metal. I looked at the head table. My mother turned her head away, suddenly fascinated by a waiter pouring sparkling water. She was an accomplice through her silence, bowing her head to the financial power my father held over her. My younger sister Claire, the bride in a dress that cost more than a down payment on a house, lifted her flute of champagne and pretended she was deaf. She was the golden child. I paid for the very college degree she used to land her corporate husband wiring my officer's salary back home month after month while I was sleeping on a cot. My reward was being forced into a drab, ill-fitting gray dress and hidden in the back. My father made it very clear that my military background did not fit the aesthetic of his high society networking event. I was a stain on his perfect, wealthy image. A United States Marine does not run. You hold your ground. I locked my jaw. My eyes automatically detached from the arrogant faces in the room and swept the ceiling. I located the brass sprinkler heads. I found the red main fire alarm pull station on the far wall. I measured the exact distance to 3 separate emergency exits, 10 paces to the kitchen doors, 15 to the outdoor patio, 20 to the main lobby. That is how my brain handles incoming fire. You do not argue with a civilian who thinks a bruised ego is a fatal wound. You assess the threat. You survive the environment. I did not cry. Crying was a useless expenditure of energy. Instead, I picked up the stiff linen napkin resting on my lap. I folded it, edge to edge, corner to corner. I creased it into a perfectly sharp, rigid square, executing the motion with the exact mechanical precision of pulling a firing pin. I pressed my thumb hard into the fabric until the joint ached. The humiliation crawled hot and heavy over my skin, a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I built a thick brick wall in my head and shoved the feeling right behind it. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Box breathing. It keeps the heart rate down when everything around you is going to hell. It keeps you from reaching across a table and breaking someone's jaw. I swallowed the hard, dry lump of anger in my throat. 15 more minutes. I calculated I only needed to endure 15 more minutes before I could slip out the side door, grab my daughter from the lobby playground, and preserve this fake, fragile peace my father demanded. I would let the sandstorm pass over me. I just had to keep my eyes shut and stay perfectly still. Then the heavy double oak doors at the front of the ballroom blew open. The massive brass hinges groaned a harsh, grinding noise that completely crushed the soft, upbeat jazz playing from the corner band. A violent gust of Ohio winter wind ripped through the entryway, slicing straight through the stagnant, overheated air of the room. The sudden drop in temperature made people gasp and pull their expensive shawls tighter. No security guard stepped forward. No event coordinator dared to intervene. Governor Daniel Mercer stood in the doorway. He wore a heavy black wool overcoat dusted with fresh snow on the broad shoulders. His posture was rigid. His eyes, sharp and cold, swept the room like a radar system, locking onto a hostile target. Before he was the most powerful politician in the state, he was a Marine officer. He stepped into a room full of corporate sycophants, and the gravity instantly shifted. The air grew dense. The polite chatter died in an instant. But that was not the thing that made my stomach drop. His left hand was reaching down, holding the tiny hand of a 3-year-old girl in a frilly pink dress. Lucy, my daughter. She must have wandered away from the hired babysitter in the lobby. Her small face looked up at the giant man in the black coat, completely unfazed by the sudden dead silence in the massive room. Richard shot up from his chair at the head table. The wooden legs scraped violently against the polished hardwood floor, a loud screech in the quiet. He plastered a slick, desperate smile across his face, his hands trembling slightly as he unbuttoned his suit jacket to present himself. He cleared his throat, pushing his chest out, preparing to deliver a rehearsed, flattering greeting to the highest authority in the state. He thought Mercer was here for him. He thought this was his moment to secure another massive construction contract. Governor Mercer walked right past him. He did not even blink. Mercer bypassed the head table like he was stepping over a pile of rotting trash on the sidewalk. He did not offer a handshake. He did not offer a nod. He locked his radar directly onto the shadows at the back of the room. He walked straight past the expensive centerpieces, past the stunned businessmen, toward the table by the bathroom, toward the woman in the dull, wrinkled dress. I know many of you have swallowed this exact disrespect from your own blood. Drop the word respect in the comments. Tell me your city and the time you are listening, and hit subscribe to stand with me today. Mercer stopped at the edge of my table, his heavy leather boots planted firmly on the floor. "There she is," Mercer said. His voice rang out across the silent ballroom, hard, metallic, unforgiving. At the head table, the heavy crystal wine glass slipped from my father's fingers. It hit the marble floor. The glass shattered into 100 jagged pieces, the dark red wine bleeding out across the pristine white stone. Time stopped moving. The sound of shattering crystal sucked the oxygen out of the massive room. Red wine bled across the white marble floor, creeping slowly toward the toes of my father's custom Italian leather shoes. The polite hum of corporate networking died instantly. Richard scrambled. He pushed his chair back, the wooden legs shrieking against the polished floor. He wiped his sweating palms on his tailored trousers and pasted a wide, desperate smile across his face. He stepped right over the broken glass, thrusting his right hand forward like a salesman closing $1 million deal. "Governor Mercer," Richard stammered, his voice thick with sudden panic. "Sir, what an absolute honor. We did not expect—" Mercer did not take the hand. He did not even look at it. The governor walked right past my father, leaving Richard standing there with his arm extended in empty air. The sycophantic smile froze on my father's face. Mercer moved with the heavy, grounded stride of a man who had worn combat boots for 20 years. His thick rubber soles thumped against the hardwood, cutting through the silence. He walked straight to the overflow table by the kitchen doors. My table. Mercer pulled out the cheap folding chair next to me. He gently set my 3-year-old daughter Lucy down on her feet. Then he placed his large calloused hands on the back of the chair and looked back at my father. "Do you mind," Mercer said, his voice dropping an octave, "if I sit with the bravest officer in the United States?" The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. The elite crowd turned to stone. The businessmen with their luxury watches and fake tans stopped breathing. The sycophancy completely jammed in my father's throat. His mouth hung open. He looked at me, the woman he had just publicly called a failure, the daughter he had shoved into the shadows, so she would not ruin his pristine aesthetic. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I kept my back perfectly straight. I looked up at the most powerful politician in the state, a man who commanded thousands, and I gave him a single measured nod. An acknowledgement between equals. Mercer sat down. "Captain Patel." 4 syllables. That was all it took to rip my father's pathetic civilian disguise to shreds. Somewhere near the front, the groom's uncle, a man who made a living trading hedge funds, tried to break the suffocating tension. He let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Governor, surely you know Caitlin through some civilian charity work. She does not exactly have a real career." Mercer stopped moving. He slowly unbuttoned his heavy black wool coat. He rested his forearms on the table. When he looked at the uncle, his eyes were burning with a quiet, terrifying violence. Civilian, Mercer repeated. The word sounded like a curse in his mouth. He turned his head, projecting his voice so every single person in that massive ballroom could hear it. 3 years ago, the river swallowed eastern Kentucky. Whole towns washed away in the dark. The civilian rescue teams pulled back. It was too dangerous. The water was moving too fast, carrying trucks and tearing houses off their concrete foundations. Mercer reached inside his coat. He did not pull out a medal. He did not pull out a polished certificate. He pulled out a piece of paper. It was a cheap, wrinkled, yellowed newspaper clipping. He slapped it down onto the white tablecloth. The smell of old newsprint and dust cut straight through the heavy, suffocating perfume in the room. My daughter and my newborn granddaughter were trapped on the second floor of a collapsed clinic. Mercer continued, his voice turning into gravel. The foundation was gone. The water was freezing. And this woman... He pointed a thick finger at me and took command when everyone else ran away. She stood shoulder-deep in freezing mud and toxic floodwater for 19 straight hours. My family's alive today because she outright refused a direct order to retreat. Mercer pushed the yellowed newspaper toward the center of the table. The photograph was grainy, but the image was unmistakable. A female Marine covered in thick black mud up to her chest, hauling an elderly man up a rope ladder toward a hovering helicopter. Her face was exhausted, hollowed out by the cold, but her grip was iron. She stood in the mud, Mercer said, staring dead into my father's eyes. And when it was over, she did not ask for a medal. She refused every single television interview. She packed her gear and went back to work. The crowd stared at the photograph. Dozens of eyes that had looked at me with pity and disgust just 10 minutes ago were now wide with horror and absolute awe. They were looking at a ghost. They were looking at someone who had walked through hell while they were complaining about the stock market. I looked at the clipping. I did not feel vindicated. The awe in their eyes meant nothing to me. They saw a hero. I only remembered the freezing cold, the smell of diesel fuel in the water, and the sound of the structural beams snapping in the dark. I looked up at my father. Richard's face was the color of dirty ash. His chest heaved. The corporate armor he wore so proudly was completely gone, leaving only a small, terrified old man. He looked at the photograph, then at me. His lower lip trembled. He grabbed onto the very last shred of his ego, trying to defend himself in front of his wealthy friends. You! Richard choked out, his voice barely a whisper. You never told me this. You never told us. For the first time all evening, I lifted my chin. I locked my dark eyes onto his. I did not yell. I did not show an ounce of anger. My voice was perfectly flat, dead, and cold as the Kentucky floodwater. You never asked. The words sliced through the air like a straight razor. Richard flinched as if he had been physically struck. Because every time I mentioned my unit, I continued, my tone completely devoid of emotion. You acted like I was tracking mud into your clean, expensive little world. I picked up my heavy silver fork. I let it drop from my fingers. The metal hit the porcelain plate with a sharp, piercing clink. The sound echoed through the dead silence of the ballroom, locking my father into his own humiliation. He stood there completely paralyzed, staring at the daughter he could no longer control. The ballroom erupted, not with music, but with the suffocating buzz of networking vultures. The wealthy men and women who had ignored me all night suddenly wanted to stand near the gravity of Governor Mercer. They crowded the table, their expensive leather shoes crunching over the broken crystal on the floor. They wanted proximity to power. I did not care. I only wanted oxygen. I scooped Lucy into my arms. Her small, warm hands grabbed the fabric of my cheap gray dress. She buried her face into my neck, overwhelmed by the sudden noise. I stepped back, letting the crowd swallow Mercer, and slipped through the swinging wooden doors toward the restrooms. The heavy doors swung shut, cutting off the noise like a severed artery. The hallway was a different world. No warm chandeliers, no clinking silver. Just the harsh, buzzing glare of cheap fluorescent tubes and a thick, ugly red carpet that absorbed the sound of my footsteps. It smelled of heavy industrial bleach and stale air. I did not make it to the restroom. Claire stepped out from the shadows of an alcove blocking the narrow hallway. Her massive custom-made white silk wedding dress filled the space from wall to wall. It looked heavy, suffocating. She looked like a porcelain doll stuffed into a white cage. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure rage. The flawless, expensive makeup was cracking. Her breathing was erratic, pulling harsh and shallow through her nose. The air around her reeked of pungent aerosol hairspray, masking the subtle scent of vodka on her breath. "You did this on purpose," Claire hissed. Her hands gripped the tight corseted waist of her dress so hard her knuckles turned bone white. I stopped. I did not shift my weight. I pressed Lucy's head gently against my collarbone, covering my daughter's exposed ear with my right hand. I did not want her listening to this poison. I looked at my younger sister. I did not see a bride. I saw a civilian in full panic mode, losing control of her secured perimeter. "You planned this!" Claire stepped closer. The layers of heavy silk rustled against the walls like dry leaves. "You brought the governor here to humiliate Dad. To ruin my wedding. You could not stand that I was getting the attention for one single day. You always have to make it about your miserable life." I looked at her. I really looked at her. I saw the rapid pulse jumping in her neck. I saw the trembling in her jaw. The absolute pathetic desperation for validation. "I do not live on attention, Claire," I said. My voice was completely flat. "You do." That single cold sentence broke her. It bypassed all her defensive armor and hit the core. The rage in her eyes shattered. Her face crumpled inward. Tears spilled over her lower eyelids, dragging thick black streaks of expensive mascara down her pale cheeks. She let go of her corseted waist. Her shoulders slumped forward, destroying her perfect posture. "Do you think I want this?" Claire's voice cracked. She was crying now, ugly and real, the sound bouncing off the cheap acoustic ceiling tiles. "Do you think I actually like this life?" I remained silent. I stood my ground and let her bleed it out. "Dad pays for my house." Claire choked out, her chest heaving. "Dad introduced me to my husband. Dad already mapped out which private school my unborn children will attend. He controls the bank accounts. He owns me, Caitlin. He owns every single breath I take." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing the black makeup further into her skin. She looked pathetic. A hostage in a $1 million gown. "You went to the military," Claire said, staring down at my scuffed boots. "You got thrown out of this family. You always thought it was because you were a failure. You thought he threw you away because you were worthless." She let out a bitter, wet laugh that sounded like coughing. "You are so blind," Claire whispered, looking back up at me. "He did not throw you away because you were weak. He threw you away because he knew you would survive the minefield. He looks at me and he sees someone weak enough to control. He looks at you and he sees iron. He's terrified of you, Caitlin. He isolated you because your brutal independence makes him feel like a coward." The words echoed in the narrow hallway. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights suddenly sounded very loud in my ears. The golden child. The perfect daughter. She was nothing but a prisoner wearing velvet handcuffs, and I was the scapegoat, the outcast. For years, I carried the heavy weight of rejection, calculating my own flaws, assuming I was defective. But the truth was entirely different. My father did not exile me because I was broken. He exiled me because my resilience threatened his fragile manufactured ego. He needed total compliance, and I was built for war. I felt the heavy brick wall in my chest shift. It did not break. It realigned. The burden of guilt I'd carried for a decade simply evaporated under the harsh fluorescent lights. I looked at the weeping woman in the white dress. I felt absolutely nothing but pity. I reached out with my free hand. I grabbed the twisted silk collar of her dress. I pulled the fabric straight, smoothing out the wrinkled edge with military precision. "Enjoy your cage, Claire." I stepped around her. The heavy silk brushed against my legs, but I did not stop. I did not look back. The main lobby was practically empty. The coat check attendant was staring at a phone screen. The temperature here was dropping fast, the Ohio winter seeping through the glass architecture. Governor Mercer was standing by the main exit. He had his heavy black wool coat fully buttoned. He was wrapping a thick gray scarf around his neck. He was not looking at the doors. He was looking back into the ballroom. I followed his line of sight. Through the wide double archways, I could see my father. Richard was no longer standing. He was sitting at the empty table completely alone, while the rest of the crowd hovered near the edges of the room whispering. His shoulders were caved in. His head hung low. He was staring blindly at the shattered crystal glass and the spilled red wine on the marble floor. He looked old. He looked entirely broken. Mercer struck the heavy rubber tip of his walking cane against the polished floor. A single solid thud that carried across the empty lobby. He spoke, and his voice was not loud, but it possessed a carrying power that demanded absolute attention. He aimed the words directly at the defeated man sitting in the ballroom. "Listen to me, Richard." Mercer's voice was dark and heavy. "When my Marines stop telling stories, their families often mistake that silence for a lack of accomplishment. They think the soldier has nothing to show for their time in the dirt." Richard slowly lifted his head, his face pale and hollow. Mercer narrowed his eyes, his voice cutting through the space like a serrated blade. "But they are wrong. That silence does not mean they did nothing. That silence means the things they keep locked inside their heads are far too bloody for a man like you to digest over a nice dinner." Mercer turned away. He gave me a single nod, pushed the side door open, and disappeared into the freezing night. I adjusted my grip on Lucy. I pushed my shoulder against the heavy double-glass doors leading out to the parking lot. The hinges gave way. The freezing Ohio blizzard hit my face like a handful of gravel. The wind howled, bearing the jazz music, bearing the clinking glasses, and completely bearing the pathetic weeping of a broken family. 9 o'clock in the morning. The Ohio winter did not care about the shattered egos of the Columbus elite. Outside the diner window, the sky was a brutal, flat gray. Snow whipped against the thick glass of the Maple Street grill in hard, stinging sheets. In the distance, the heavy metallic growl of a city snowplow chewed through the iced asphalt, pushing mounds of dirty, salt-stained slush toward the concrete curbs. Inside, the air was suffocatingly thick. It smelled like burnt filter coffee, old bacon grease, and damp wool. I sat in the far corner booth. My back was pressed flat against the cheap red vinyl of the seat. It was the only spot in the entire building that offered a clear, unobstructed sightline to the front door, the kitchen pass, and the emergency exit in the back. Old habits do not die. They just adapt to civilian architecture. Lucy sat next to me, kicking her small boots under the table, dragging a blue crayon across a cheap coloring book. The brass bells above the front door jingled. A violent blast of sub-zero wind rushed into the diner, cutting straight through the artificial heat. Richard Patel walked in. He did not look like the untouchable real estate king of Franklin County anymore. The tailored Italian suit was gone. He wore a cheap, oversized nylon parka that swished loudly with every slow step he took. His shoulders were slumped, caving inward under an invisible weight. His expensive leather shoes were heavily stained with gray slush and road salt. He looked small. He looked like an old man who had finally realized his massive bank account could not buy him a spine. He saw me in the corner. He hesitated. Then he dragged his feet across the cracked linoleum floor and slid into the booth across from me. No waitress came over. We did not order food. The silence between us was heavier than the blizzard outside. It was a dense, suffocating vacuum. Richard stared at the scratched formica table. He rubbed his hands together. They were trembling, the skin pale and dry. He was trying to find the words, trying to build a fragile bridge over a dark canyon he had spent 30 years digging. I always thought giving you space was the right thing to do," Richard said. His voice was thin, shaky. It was a pathetic, ragged attempt at damage control. He could not look me in the eye. "You were always so fiercely independent, Caitlin," he continued, stumbling over his own lies. "I thought keeping my distance was a sign of respect. I thought you wanted it that way." I held a tall glass of ice water. I was stirring it slowly with a plastic straw. When he spoke, my hand stopped moving. I looked up. I locked my eyes onto his face. I did not blink. I analyzed him the exact same way I would analyze a structural weakness in a compromised building. "No," I said. One word. It hit the table like a lead weight. "You gave Claire investments," I said, my voice completely devoid of warmth. "You gave her a house, a husband, and a trust fund. You threw me a massive void of distance, and you dared to call it training. You called it respect, because admitting you were terrified of me would shatter your own fragile ego." Richard swallowed hard. The remaining color drained completely from his face. His flimsy excuse shattered into pieces. He looked down at his trembling hands, completely unable to hold my gaze. He was a man used to buying his way out of guilt, used to silencing his critics with a checkbook. He had absolutely no currency here. The tension in the booth was thick enough to choke on. Richard was suffocating under his own cowardice. He slept soundly on a premium mattress paid for by luxury housing developments, completely insulated from the ugly realities of the world. He had no idea what it cost to keep a nation safe so men like him could play golf on Sundays. While he was negotiating profit margins, I was holding pressure on severed arteries. Then the silence broke. Not by me, not by him. Lucy stopped coloring. She looked up, her large brown eyes blinking innocently at the broken man across the table. "Grandpa," Lucy said, her high, sweet voice cutting through the smell of burnt coffee. "Mommy cries really loud when she sleeps sometimes." Richard's head snapped up. His eyes went wide. Lucy looked back down at her crayon, completely unaware of the bomb she had just dropped directly onto the table. "She yells a lot," the 3-year-old murmured, focusing on coloring a dog. "She always says, 'Do not leave him there.'" I have to pat her hair until she stops. The words hung in the air. "Do not leave him there." The ghost of a young corporal trapped under a burning transport vehicle, bleeding out in the dirt, while the radio screamed static. The ghost of an old man trapped under the Kentucky floodwaters, screaming my name as the freezing current dragged him under the surface. The countless nights I spent pacing the floorboards of my apartment, trying to outrun the echoes of a radio transmission that nobody else could hear. The nights I woke up choking on phantom water. PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I saw the realization hit Richard. The letters flashed across his wide eyes. The sudden horrifying realization that while he was embarrassed by my uniform, I was carrying the heavy weight of the dead. I was suffering the brutal consequences of the violence that kept his world turning. His breathing turned shallow and frantic. The cheap nylon jacket rustled loudly as his chest heaved. "You!" Richard gasped, his voice breaking completely. "You never told me that." I reached out and placed my hand gently on Lucy's shoulder. I smoothed her soft hair. My daughter was the only pure thing in this entire city. She was the innocent witness to the nightmare I kept locked beneath my ribs. I did not break eye contact with my father. I did not offer him comfort. I did not offer him tears. I gave him the absolute, brutal truth. "You never asked," I said. My voice was dry, dead. It carried the crushing weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "You never wanted to know," I continued, leaning slightly forward, closing the distance between us. "Because you only wanted clean, sanitized military stories you could brag about at the country club. You wanted the shiny medals, but you did not want the blood. You are terrified of blood, Richard. You are terrified of actual trauma. Because acknowledging my pain means acknowledging your own pathetic weakness." Richard shrank back against the booth. He covered his mouth with his trembling hand, a muffled sob trapped in his throat. He was entirely broken. I reached into the pocket of my coat. I pulled out a crisp $20 bill. I did not hand it to him. I dropped it onto the table. It fluttered down, landing right on top of the wet water rings. "Pay for the coffee," I said. I stood up. I picked up Lucy in one fluid motion, grabbing her small pink coat from the seat. I did not wait for a response. I did not look back to see if he was crying. I pushed the heavy glass door of the diner open. The bells jingled one last time. We stepped out into the freezing Ohio morning, letting the howling white snowstorm erase the sight of the man I used to call my father. Sunday evening inside the Patel mansion felt like a waiting room at a morgue. The massive house in the wealthy suburbs of Columbus was completely silent. The forced air heating pushed a dry, sterile breeze through the vaulted ceilings. The air smelled of expensive lemon wood polish and nothing else. There was no music. There was no conversation. Richard sat alone at the head of the long mahogany dining table. He stared blindly at the polished wood. The freezing storm outside hammered against the reinforced glass windows, but the cold inside his chest was much worse. The doorbell rang. It was a sharp, piercing chime that made Richard flinch. He pushed himself up. His joints felt stiff. He walked slowly across the wide foyer and pulled the heavy front door open. A freezing gust of wind blew into the pristine entryway, carrying a scatter of dead leaves and white snow. Standing on the welcome mat was Harold Bennett. Harold was an old man with a face like tanned leather pulled tight over a skull. He wore a faded olive-drab field jacket. The left sleeve was pinned up flat against the shoulder, empty since a mortar attack at Khe Sanh in 1968. He did not wipe his heavy mud-caked combat boots on the expensive mat. He just stepped inside. Harold did not carry a weapon, but his presence was an active threat. He held a battered, water-stained cardboard box tucked tightly under his remaining right arm. "Harold," Richard said, his voice weak. "What are you doing here?" The old Marine did not say a word. He walked past Richard, his muddy boots, leaving thick, dirty tracks across the flawless white marble floor. He marched straight into the formal dining room. He stopped at the head of the mahogany table. He raised his right arm and slammed the dirty cardboard box down onto the polished wood. The impact sounded like a gunshot. Dust bloomed into the sterile air. Harold turned around. He looked at Richard with eyes that had seen the jungle burn. "Walter left this with me before he died," Harold said. His voice was raw, grinding like two heavy stones rubbing together. "He gave me a direct order. He told me to hand-deliver this box to you the day the girl made captain." Richard stared at the dirty cardboard. He swallowed hard. "Caitlin was promoted to captain 3 years ago." "I know," Harold said. He stepped closer. The smell of cheap tobacco and old wool rolled off his jacket. "I waited. I wanted to see if you would ever figure it out on your own. You did not." Harold turned his head and spit an imaginary wad of tobacco onto the expensive Persian rug. He locked his dark, sunken eyes onto the wealthy real estate developer. "You are a miserable coward, Frank," Harold growled, using Richard's birth name, the name he had tried to erase when he started building mansions. "You are an absolute disgrace to this bloodline." Harold turned his back. He marched out the front door, leaving it wide open to the freezing storm. Richard stood frozen. The wind howled through the foyer, but he did not move to shut the door. He walked slowly toward the dining table. The cardboard box sat there, ugly and out of place, defiling his perfect house. The top was sealed with old yellowed packing tape that had turned brittle with age. Richard reached out. His hands were shaking violently. He dug his manicured fingernails under the edge of the tape and pulled. The dry adhesive ripped with a loud, harsh screech. He folded the cardboard flaps back. The smell of mildew, stale air, and dry aging paper hit his face. There were no gold watches inside. There were no stock certificates. There was no money. There was a stack of 6 local newspapers. Richard reached in with trembling fingers. He pulled the top newspaper out and laid it flat on the mahogany table. It was the Columbus Dispatch from 3 years ago. The front page of the Metro section featured a photograph of a military promotion ceremony. Right in the center of the page, someone had drawn a thick, heavy circle using a red permanent marker. Inside the red circle was Caitlin. She was standing at attention in her dress uniform, her silver captain bars pinned to her collar. Richard stared at the date on the top of the page. The memory hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He remembered that exact day. It was a beautiful, clear Tuesday in May. He and his wife were playing 18 holes at the Muirfield Village Golf Club. They had turned their cell phones off. They drank cold iced tea on the clubhouse patio while they calculated their quarterly profits. He looked closely at the photograph. Around Caitlin, there were thousands of other military personnel. Husbands were hugging their wives. Fathers were pinning medals onto their sons. Mothers were crying. Caitlin stood completely alone, an island of gray steel in a sea of celebrating families. Nobody came for her. Nobody cheered for her. Her own father was teeing off on the 9th hole, completely ignoring the fact that his flesh and blood was taking an oath to bleed for her country. Richard pulled out the next newspaper. Another red circle, another photograph of Caitlin, then another. 6 in total. Walter Patel, a decorated Vietnam veteran who had spent the last years of his life battling his own demons, had crawled out of his dark bedroom. He had driven his rusted truck down to the corner store. He had bought every single newspaper he could find. He sat at his small kitchen table in the dark, cutting and circling the pages, honoring his granddaughter in total, absolute silence. He was proud of her. He recognized the warrior in her. At the very bottom of the cardboard box resting on the bare flaps was a single white envelope. Richard reached down. His breath hitched in his throat. The paper felt rough against his skin. He recognized the erratic, shaky handwriting immediately. It was his father's scrawl. He opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper. He read the words out loud, his voice cracking in the empty room. Frank, if you cannot see the absolute nobility in your daughter's life, the defect is in your own brain. You have spent your entire life hiding your cowardice behind custom suits and bank accounts. She walked straight through the fire, and she got deep. You just got cruel. I know why you hate the uniform. You look at her and you see me. You see the madness I brought back from the jungle. You see the nightmares. But she is not broken, Frank. She is iron. She carries the weight that you were always too weak to lift. Do not ever force her to apologize for a strength you will never possess. The lined notebook paper slipped from Richard's trembling fingers. It drifted through the air and landed softly on the Persian rug. Richard grabbed the edge of the mahogany table. His knuckles turned white. His chest tightened so fast he thought his heart was going to burst. He gasped for air, but the room felt completely empty of oxygen. The massive, impenetrable wall of arrogance he had spent 40 years building finally collapsed. It did not just crack, it disintegrated into dust. He realized the absolute horror of what he had done. He had abused his own daughter. He had exiled her. He had let her stand alone on the most important days of her life simply because he was terrified. He was terrified of the blood. He was terrified of the trauma. He punished Caitlin for surviving a world he was too much of a coward to even acknowledge. His legs gave out. Richard Patel dropped to his knees. The impact sent a dull thud through the floorboards. He collapsed onto the expensive imported Persian rug. He wrapped his arms around his own chest, burying his face into the fabric of his shirt. In the massive, empty, multi-million-dollar mansion, the wealthy real estate king broke. He let out a loud, ragged sob. The sound tore out of his throat, raw and pathetic. He cried. He cried like a trapped, cornered animal, bleeding out in the dark, completely crushed by the unbearable weight of a cardboard box. 1 month later. The rotunda of the Ohio State House was massive. The high domed ceiling stretched far above, bouncing the sharp sound of leather heels clicking against the cold marble floor. The air smelled of polished stone floor wax and heavy wool. I stood near the front podium. I wore my Marine Corps dress blues. The brass buttons were polished tight, catching the bright overhead lights. The high, stiff collar dug firmly into the skin of my neck. I kept my bare hands folded securely behind my back, standing strictly at parade rest. I scanned the room out of pure survival habit, checking the main exits, measuring the exact distance to the heavy oak doors. In the very last row of the folding chairs, sitting completely in the shadows, was Richard. He did not look like a man who owned half the commercial real estate in Columbus. He looked small. He wore a plain, unremarkable gray coat. He kept his head down, staring blankly at the marble floor between his expensive leather shoes. An older man with silver hair and silver eagles pinned to his shoulders walked past the back row. A Marine colonel. The colonel stopped, recognizing Richard from the local business magazines. The colonel gave a short, crisp nod. "You have a great daughter, sir." The colonel said, his voice low and respectful. "A real giant." Richard swallowed hard. I saw his Adam's apple bob from all the way across the room. A cold shiver visibly ran down his spine. He nodded back, but he could not force any words out of his mouth. He realized in that exact second that all his millions of dollars in offshore accounts could never buy a single ounce of the respect that was standing on that stage. Governor Daniel Mercer stepped up to the wooden podium. He adjusted the microphone. The sharp screech of audio feedback cut through the rotunda, forcing the crowd to fall completely silent. Mercer did not smile. He looked out over the crowd of politicians, military brass, and local reporters. "Some of the strongest Americans," Mercer said, his voice echoing off the high stone walls, "are the ones nobody ever notices. We like loud heroes. We like shiny medals and action movies. But real service is dirty. It is exhausting, and it is usually done in the dark." Mercer turned his head and looked directly at me. "Captain Patel represents the absolute highest form of duty. She represents quiet sacrifice completely free of bitterness. She did the job when the flood water was rising. And when the water receded, she did not ask for a parade. She did not ask for a television interview. She just went home to raise her daughter. The rotunda erupted. The applause was deafening. It bounced off the marble columns and rattled the glass windows. Hundreds of people were clapping, looking straight at me. I did not smile. I did not wave. I stood perfectly still. I kept my eyes locked on the back wall, staring at a blank space above the red exit signs. I did not hear the clapping. I heard the static of a broken radio transmission. I smelled burning diesel fuel and wet toxic dirt. I thought about the names that would never get called in a warm, safe building like this. The applause meant nothing to me. It only confirmed my value to them. I already knew my value. The ceremony ended. The crowd filtered out into the bitter Ohio winter. I pushed the heavy brass doors open. The freezing air hit my face like a sheet of solid ice. Snow was falling hard, piling up heavily on the concrete steps covering the city streets in a thick, blinding layer of white. I buttoned my heavy overcoat, holding Lucy close to my chest. She was wrapped securely in a thick wool blanket, sleeping soundly against my shoulder, completely unaffected by the freezing wind. I heard the heavy crunch of snow behind me. Richard stepped out from behind a large stone pillar. He did not have his driver waiting. He did not have his usual arrogant sweeping stride. He dragged his feet through the thick snow, stopping 3 paces away from me. He looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with heavy red lines. The wind howled loudly around us, whipping the freezing snow directly into our faces. Richard started. His voice broke instantly. It was fragile, easily carried away by the harsh winter wind. He cleared his throat and forced himself to look at the uniform I was wearing under my coat. I waited for so many years for you to become someone I could brag about. Richard said, his voice cracking, completely stripped of all his corporate pride. I wanted someone who fit cleanly into my perfect world. But the brutal truth is, you became someone to revere. He reached up and wiped a flake of snow from his wrinkled cheek. His bare hand was shaking violently in the cold. You became a giant, and I was just too emotionally crippled to realize the difference between a shiny trophy and actual iron. It was a genuine confession. It was raw, ugly, and entirely true. But it was 30 years too late. 30 years of isolation, mockery, and psychological abuse could not be erased by a single moment of clarity on the steps of the State House. I did not feel any anger toward him anymore. The rage had burned out a long time ago. All that was left inside my chest was a deep, cold indifference. I looked at the man who gave me half my DNA. I did not drop a single tear. I did not step forward to embrace him. I adjusted the warm blanket around my sleeping daughter. I gave him one single, barely noticeable nod. Stay warm, Richard. I did not call him Dad. I spoke his name like a stranger, passing casually on the street. The forgiveness was absolute, but the boundary was permanent. It was a sharp blade slicing cleanly through the last remaining tie between us. I turned around. I walked down the concrete steps, the snow crunching heavily under my combat boots. I strapped Lucy into her warm car seat, shut the heavy metal door, and started the engine. I drove away into the whiteout conditions, leaving the broken real estate king standing completely frozen in the blizzard, clutching the most expensive lesson of his entire life. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic blood to protect your own peace, drop the word peace in the comments below. Let me know where you are listening from tonight. Please like, subscribe, and I will see you next time.